Something happened during a conversation with Russ Taff that the people in that room had no way of preparing for. He had been talking about forgiveness, about what the gospel actually demands of those who claim to believe it, about the long and uncomfortable distance between what we sing and what we live. And then he paused, and he named the singer, the one singer. The one he said he had spent a lifetime failing to forgive. When that name landed, the room went quiet. Not the way rooms go quiet after a shocking accusation, the way rooms go quiet when someone has told a truth that everyone already sensed was there, circling just beneath the surface of every conversation they'd ever had about grace. What makes Russ's admission so unexpected is not that he pointed at an enemy. It's who he named. Because anyone who has spent decades watching him stand on the Gaither Homecoming stage, voice open and wide, singing about mercy and redemption, to audiences who loved him as much for what he represented as for how he sounded, would not have seen this coming. And yet, the moment you hear it in full, something in your chest recognizes it immediately, because it's a truth most people have carried at some point in their own lives, usually in private, usually without a name for it. Stay with this, because what Russ Taff revealed, and what his wife Tori confirmed when she told her own version of those years, is something the gospel community has circled around for a long time without quite landing on directly. The moment in this story that changes everything comes at the 10-minute mark, and every minute before it earns the weight of what he said. To understand why Russ Taff's words carried the force they did, you have to first understand who he is to the people who have loved him across 4 decades of Christian music. He isn't simply a singer. Among all the artists who have gathered around Bill Gaither's piano and filled those beloved homecoming videos with music that millions of families still play on Sunday mornings, Russ occupies a space that very few have ever reached. His voice, that raw, aching, wide-open instrument that moves from tenderness to thunder between one breath and the next, drew descriptions from fellow artists that people outside the gospel world sometimes find hard to believe. Not one of the best voices in Christian music, one of the most extraordinary voices in any room he ever walked into. If you've ever sat close enough to hear him sing without a microphone between you and the sound, you understand why the distinction matters. Growing up in Farmersville, California, as the son of a Pentecostal preacher, Russ came to music not as a career path, but as the primary language his family used to reach toward something holy. The Imperials claimed him in the late 1970s, and those years inside one of Southern gospel's most storied groups shaped the artist the homecoming community would eventually treasure. Dove Awards followed. Grammy nominations followed. And by the time his face became familiar to the millions of fans who watched those Gaither Homecoming videos, those sprawling, joyful, unrehearsed-feeling gatherings that eventually reached homes across the country, Russ Taff already carried a reputation that walked into a room before he did. For the fans who grew up watching those recordings, who wore out the VHS tapes and later the DVDs on weekend mornings, Russ wasn't simply filling a slot in a lineup. His voice was part of the soundtrack of their faith. When he opened his mouth, something happened that the people in those rooms usually stopped trying to explain, because the explanation always fell short of the experience. For millions of people who discovered gospel music through those videos, Russ wasn't just a performer. He was part of the fabric of how they understood what devotion sounded like. That is who this story is about. And the reason it matters is what was happening beneath the surface during all those years when the music was at its most beautiful. Carrying a private war inside a public ministry creates a particular kind of weight, because the ministry keeps moving forward, regardless of what the man inside it is facing. Stages keep being set. Cameras keep rolling. Audiences keep arriving and expecting the voice they came to hear. And every performance of joy or peace or hard-won freedom becomes, in the quiet moments after, a reminder of the distance between what you're singing and what you're actually living. Russ Taff carried that kind of weight for years. His struggle with alcohol, a battle kept hidden from nearly everyone in the gospel community while he delivered homecoming performances that fans still talk about today, wasn't a brief stumble that resolved quietly. It stretched across some of the most visible years of his career, and it cost him things that no documentary can fully account for. What made the situation so complicated was its origin. His father, a man of genuine faith and genuine calling, had fought the same battle. Growing up inside that home, watching devotion and addiction occupy the same space in the same person, left marks that didn't fade when Russ's own gifts began opening doors he hadn't imagined. The very thing he had feared most about his father surfaced in himself. And for a man whose entire public identity rested on the proclamation of freedom and deliverance, the weight of that particular irony was not something he could easily set down. Tori knew. She had known for longer than most people realized when the full story finally came out, and she stayed, not out of obligation, but out of a love that the two of them have spoken about in interviews that are genuinely difficult to sit through without being moved. Those years required her to carry a grief she couldn't share with anyone in the gospel community, because sharing it would have unraveled everything Russ had spent decades building. What she held in private, so that his ministry could continue in public, is its own form of sacrifice. And that sacrifice doesn't get mentioned nearly often enough when people tell his story. By 2017, when filmmaker Rick Altizer's documentary brought the full account into the open, the gospel community had a decision to make about what to do with the truth. Most of it chose grace. Bill Gaither, who has never been a man to walk away from someone in a difficult season, stood firmly in Russ's corner throughout that period. The Homecoming family absorbed the revelation with something that looked a great deal like relief, as if the truth had finally answered a question that nobody had found the right words to ask. The response from longtime fans was, in many ways, more generous than Russ had allowed himself to hope for. And that generosity points directly toward the part of the story that most coverage never fully examined. But here's the thing that nobody quite named clearly. And this is where the story becomes something more than a testimony about addiction and sobriety. Because what Russ said in the years after the documentary, and what Tori confirmed from her own vantage point, is the piece that the gospel world has understood privately without ever saying it at full volume. Stay with this. And this is where the story turns in the direction nobody in his circle anticipated. When Russ Taff named the singer he had never been able to forgive, no accusation waited behind that pause. No old professional grievance was surfacing. No name from his years with the Imperials. No figure from the homecoming world. No person who had wronged him during the long arc of his career. The singer Russ Taff had spent decades failing to forgive was the one whose face he saw in the mirror every morning. He was talking about himself, and the gospel community went quiet because everyone who heard it understood immediately. Self-forgiveness is the hardest kind there is. Forgiving another person, however genuinely demanding that work can be, moves in a clear direction. Grace extends outward. The relationship either heals or it doesn't. The act itself has a beginning and a shape. Self-forgiveness is entirely different in its architecture. It circles back. It waits on every stage, in every lyric about mercy you've ever sung for someone else's benefit, in every audience member who came looking for something to hold on to and found it in your voice. Russ had delivered "We Will Stand" and moved entire arenas to tears. He had lifted that voice alongside David Phelps and Mark Lowry and Gloria Gaither and the whole extraordinary gathering that Bill Gaither had assembled over the years. And the music was always genuine. It never stopped being genuine. But the man performing it had not found a way to extend to himself the grace he was proclaiming to everyone around him. In interviews across the years since the documentary, Russ has talked about this with a directness that is uncomfortable in the best possible way. All those years of concealment had convinced him, on a level below conscious theology, that he had disqualified himself, not just from the career, but from the very grace his voice had been proclaiming night after night across decades of stages. Tori's love didn't dissolve that. Bill Gaither's loyalty didn't dissolve it. Even the generous response from the homecoming community couldn't reach the place where the unforgiveness lived, because none of those things could do that particular work from the outside. What Russ has described is a long, slow decision. Not a single moment of resolution, but a sustained practice of choosing to apply to himself the same grace that the gospel had always claimed was available to everyone. And when he put that into words publicly, the response from people who had followed his ministry for decades wasn't argument or discomfort. It was recognition. The sound of people understanding that they had just heard something true about themselves, not just about him. Tori, in her own account of those years since the documentary, described watching Russ sing about redemption and seeing something shift in his expression that she had learned to read over time. Getting sober, she said, was visible from the outside. That change had external evidence. The process of actually forgiving himself happened somewhere she couldn't quite see. She could only watch for its effects. And she described those effects arriving slowly, in the way that most of the things worth waiting for actually arrive. Quietly, without announcement, long after you've stopped expecting them on any particular day. For a man whose instrument has always been understood in terms of its outward power, its capacity to fill a room, to break through the careful composure of people who came determined not to cry, to carry something real to the back of an arena, the private nature of that particular struggle makes a kind of sense. Some of the most significant things that happen to a person are invisible to everyone who loves them most. The audience always saw the voice. Only Russ knew the full weight of the man carrying it. For those of us who followed Russ Taff across those homecoming years, who watched him perform and felt something genuine move through the room and assumed we understood the source of it, this revelation settles into place differently than a simpler story would. Gospel music has always carried a tension it doesn't always resolve honestly. Freedom gets announced from stages by people who are sometimes still privately bound. Grace extends outward toward audiences, while the ones holding the microphone sometimes find it most difficult to receive. Russ's story doesn't frame that tension as hypocrisy. It frames it as the human condition. And the difference between those two framings is enormous. What his willingness to name himself, to place himself in the position of the unforgiven singer, the one he had judged most harshly and known longest, tells us about faith and endurance is worth sitting with. The tradition that produced Russ Taff has never defined faith as the absence of struggle. It has always defined faith as the decision to keep moving through the struggle regardless. He kept showing up. He kept singing. He kept offering his voice to something larger than himself, even during the years when he couldn't offer himself the most basic form of grace. And eventually, he began doing the harder and quieter work that had no audience. If you've followed Russ since those early homecoming recordings, since the sessions when Bill gathered some of the most gifted voices in Christian music into a room and simply let them sing together, then you understand what we mean when we say his story holds more than most. His voice was never just a technical gift. It was an argument that redemption is real and available and worth proclaiming at full volume. The chapter he's living now doesn't weaken that argument by one syllable. What it does is deepen that argument in ways the earlier years couldn't have reached. That question this story leaves behind is a personal one, and it belongs to every person watching. Whose name would you put in that place where Russ put his own? Because most people have one. Most people who have spent a lifetime inside a faith tradition have a private version of the same struggle. The distance between the grace they believe is real for everyone around them and the grace they haven't been able to fully accept for themselves. Russ Taff named that thing. He said it out loud, and the gospel world went quiet because, for a moment, everyone who heard it was listening to their own version of the same silence. There's one more part of this story that most people haven't connected yet, and it reaches back further than the documentary and further than the homecoming years themselves. Bill Gaither has spoken in various settings about those years when Russ's internal struggle remained invisible to almost everyone around him, when the performances were delivering something extraordinary to the rooms full of fans, and something in Russ's eyes was telling a different story to anyone paying close enough attention. Bill described, in terms he returned to more than once, a moment backstage when he looked at Russ and offered words to the effect that, whatever you're carrying right now, your voice still carries something real, and that hasn't gone away. The full truth wasn't known to him at that point, but he knew that Russ was fighting something, and he chose to speak to what he could see clearly rather than probe for what he couldn't. That quality, seeing the person inside the performer and choosing to speak to that person rather than to the performance, is what Bill Gaither has always done best. It's the quality that drew so many extraordinary artists into the homecoming world across the years. Michael English, whose own very public fall and slow restoration played out inside that same community in ways that shook Southern gospel in the early 1990s, has spoken about how Bill's consistency during the hardest seasons was something he never stopped being grateful for. The Homecoming Circle has functioned, at various points in its history, as the place where artists who had nowhere else to go discovered that a seat had been held for them. Russ Taff fits inside that larger pattern, but his story carries its own particular texture. External forgiveness arrived relatively quickly once the truth became known. The gospel community extended grace with a speed and sincerity that surprised even those who knew it best. What took far longer, what remains, by Russ's own account, an ongoing practice rather than a completed chapter, is the internal version. And the fact that he can name it clearly now, that he can sit in a room and say the thing without flinching, represents a kind of hard-won clarity that very few people ever reach. His voice in these later years carries something different from what it held in those early recordings. Not less, different. The power is still present, the rawness is still there, but underneath both of those qualities, there's a texture that people who know the full story hear in a way they didn't before. Something has been carried across a long distance and, at least in part, set down. No studio produces that quality. No technical training reaches it. That particular texture comes from somewhere that only long experience, honestly reckoned with, can create. What comes next for Russ Taff is something the gospel community will watch with genuine affection and genuine investment. He has given this tradition some of its most beloved moments, moments that people return to not as nostalgia, but as sustenance. And the story he's living now has no tidy conclusion, which is part of what makes it worth following. Whether any of us fully complete the work of self-forgiveness is a question Russ himself has left open, and that honesty is part of what makes his telling of it worth hearing. Faith in the tradition that runs through every homecoming recording and every Sunday morning when someone presses play on a familiar song has never been a destination arrived at once and then held permanently. It's a practice, a return, a decision made again and again in different forms across the whole length of a life. Whatever the next chapter holds for Russ, for his voice, for his family, for his place inside the community that has loved him for so long, the people who have followed him since those early mornings when Bill Gaither first gathered his friends to sing together can say one thing with certainty. This story isn't finished. The man who stood on those stages and gave so many people something to hold on to when their own faith needed something to hold on to hasn't stopped being that person. He has simply become more honest about what it cost him to be there. And if something in this story put words to a truth you've been carrying yourself, the next video in this series will do the same. We've been following the private struggles and hard-earned legacies of the artists who built the Gaither Homecoming world. And what surfaces in story after story is the same quiet thing that Russ said when the room went still. The hardest person to forgive is almost always the one who should have known better. The one you've lived inside the longest. The one whose failures you know most precisely. And the grace that reaches even there is the grace worth singing about.